All right, welcome everyone. My name is Marc-André Heath. I am the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. Those joining us here in person, as well as those joining us online, welcome to our 10th annual MacPherson Talk. Now, before we begin today's conversation, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory. That's the land of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Dene, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota for millennia, as well as the traditional homeland of the Métis. We're grateful for this opportunity to work on this land, share in its bounty, reflect on its beauty, and reaffirm our commitment to the hard, shared, and necessary work of reconciliation. And I'd like to take this opportunity to honor the late, great Ian MacPherson. He was a bit of a legendary figure and one of the leading lights in the international cooperative movement. He was an historian, cooperative activist, and he personified the bridge between scholarship and practice. He had many, many roles. He was chair of the International Cooperative Alliance. They revised the cooperative principles in 1995 when he was chair to include care for communities as principle number 7. I think this might come up a little later. He was also Canadian co-founder of the Canadian Association for the Study of Cooperation. And he was also tapped to be the first director of our research center way back in 1984, but things didn't quite go. Now, traditionally and consistent with Dr. MacPherson's kind of propensity to build bridges between the academic and practitioner worlds, we usually try to alternate speakers between those two spheres. But this year, we're going to be doing things a little different. And part of the reason, and we're going to have an academic for a second year in a row. Part of the reason we're doing that is this is our 40th anniversary. And as part of that 40th anniversary, we're kind of tackling some big, important questions like the one Dr. Heath is going to ask tonight and consider tonight, namely, are cooperatives more virtuous than other organizations? Now, one thing I'm kind of proud of at our center is we've never really shied away from these tough questions. In fact, Thoreau Massey's book on the history of the center goes into great length on this point. And in fact, I'd say our center has long distinguished itself by embracing a form of, maybe I can call it prairie pragmatism, that recognizes that co-ops are appropriate in some circumstances and maybe not always a good fit in others. And in fact, our sister organization, Cooperatives First, is sort of premised on this idea. It has a kind of roots in a kind of evolutionary perspective, one that asks whether the policy and economic environment is conducive for selecting for cooperatives as an organizational form. So that said, despite our sometimes dispassionate disposition, I'd say many of us also have some normative commitments to the idea that the world would be a better place if we had more democratic organizations, more places where people can practice democracy and all its messiness, and I know Joe's going to talk about this, to see its reflections in our larger political discourse. So I think it's that flicker of utopianism, I think maybe that animates us at the center that Dr. Heath is going to challenge us to think critically about tonight or this afternoon. And so I just, really looking forward to this talk. Now, before I ask Joe to come up to the stage, share a few words about some background. And Joe, as I mentioned earlier, I pulled a lot of this from various websites at the University of Toronto, and I hope it's not too outdated. But this much I know for certain. You are a professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto. Check. You check that one. His research interests include social and political philosophy, business ethics, moral philosophy, and distributive justice. And your university college website tells me that you were formerly the director of the Center for Ethics. We talked about this at lunch. You also taught and still teach at the School of Public Policy and Governance, University of Toronto, and that's a nice fit for our policy school here. I also understand that at least at one point, describe your work as all related in one way or another to critical social theory in the tradition of the Frankfurt School. Dr. Heath has published both academic and popular writings, including the bestseller Rebel Cell, where I first encountered his work with Andrew Pyer. His philosophical work includes papers and books in political philosophy, business ethics, rational choice theory, action theory, and critical theory. Just a few of the accolades I'll flag here. In 2012, Dr. Heath was the recipient of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellowship. In 2013, he was named to the Royal Society of Canada. His popular book, Enlightenment 2.0, won the 2014 Chauncey Cohen Prize for Political Writing. And his talk today will be informed by one of his more recent books, although there's been quite a few lately, Cooperation and Social Justice, which in 2022 was shortlisted for the prestigious Donner Prize in Public Policy. I should also note, and we've discussed this at some length today, that Dr. Heath Joe is from Saskatoon. Grew up here, as is his partner, so he has some real credibility coming home. So welcome home, Joe. I think I can say that. And then a few comments on how the event's going to proceed. I'm going to ask everyone online to stay muted and turn off your video during the presentation. Dr. Heath is going to present for roughly 45 minutes. After the presentation, we'll open up things for questions. For people who are in person, if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you. If you're online, want to ask a question, please add your question to the Zoom chat and Stan will read the question on your behalf, or I may do that. If you have any logistical challenges, please send a chat to Stan as well, and he'll help you out with that. Also, finally, we're going to be recording this and publishing in our YouTube channel. So if you prefer not to be included in the recording, you can turn off your camera and change your name on Zoom to remain anonymous. So with that, I'd like to welcome Joe to the stage. Thanks very much, Joe, and welcome to Saskatoon.
Yeah, I'm fired up. Okay, well, so thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. So yes, I eagerly accepted the invitation, in part because it's been a long time since I've been to Saskatoon, and yes, so I was raised over on Clarence Avenue, and I'm a proud graduate of Botanic Collegiate, but it's been a very long time since I've been back in town. But also my thinking about cooperatives is in part a reflection of having been raised in Saskatoon, because cooperatives were a very big deal when I was growing up, and so my first bank card was from the Saskatoon Credit Union. We always used to shop at the Co-op grocery on 8th Street. There's actually in family lore, there's like a very famous story about my mother once running out of gas in the car because she refused to buy gas at the Esso station and proceeded to continue to find the Co-op gas station and then ran out of gas on the way there and had to get towed and so on. So I kind of raised in an environment where the assumption was that cooperatives were quite virtuous, but also like being raised in Saskatchewan in the 1970s, you could actually spend a great deal of your life having practically no interaction with capitalist firms. That is between the province and the cooperative sector. You could sort of take care of about 90% of your needs. So it really wasn't until I moved to Quebec that I actually, bought a telephone for the first time from a private corporation and so forth. So I was definitely sort of raised in an environment of thinking that cooperatives sort of had a significant, they had a sort of aura about them, which is in part what I want to talk about today. The second thing I just want to say is that, so I'm in a department of philosophy. It's not an accident that I'm discussing this issue because it's been it's been a significant series of debates around cooperatives in political economy in recent years. And part of the reason I sort of left the opportunity was that I'm keen to talk to people who actually know things empirically and institutionally about how cooperatives function. Because right now cooperatives figure very large in sort of like what you think of it as like the remains of the socialist project. In other words, people are thinking about political economy, or at the moment there's like renewed interest in particular around models of worker democracy, and then worker co-ops naturally sort of figure in that discussion. Part of the reason why cooperatives are being asked to bear this burden at the moment is that through a kind of process of osmosis, I think pretty much everybody now has accepted the fact that no matter what your utopian scheme for the transformation of the economy might be, you basically have to accept the market as the mechanism for the determination of prices, right? So you need to have prices, and the best way to get the right set of prices is to have a set of competitive firms determining those prices. And so once central planning and variance of it are off the agenda and you accept the market, then the question becomes what's left of the socialist project. And then a lot then of utopian energy has become invested in the idea of the firm and the thought that you may be able to institute various governance reform within the firm that would result in the amelioration of certain of the sort of like traditional pathologies of capitalism. So there's this really significant interest now in cooperatives and in firm governance issues quite generally. Again, it's the thought though that changing governance and changing ownership has the potential to generate sort of benefits for society, right? So the thought is that there's a certain virtue of cooperatives that your typical business corporation, right, or the capitalist firm lacks. And so that's what I want to evaluate in particular in this talk. So the one thing I want to sort of just say from the outset, though, is that there's absolutely no question that cooperatives generate benefits for their members, right? So if their patrons, right, for their owners, right? That's completely, I mean, that's why they're the owners, is because the cooperative is generating benefits for them. So I don't want to question that. I absolutely think they possess virtue in that respect. What I'm interested in is the question of whether they produce external benefits, right? So whether or not society as a whole benefits from having a cooperative in a particular sector, above and beyond the benefits that go to the members. And there are 4 different claims that have been made that I want to evaluate, pointing to specific advantages of the cooperative firm over the standard business corporation, that make a cooperative economy in some sense morally better than the traditional capitalist firm. So the first claim then is that the cooperatives are more democratic. The second is the cooperatives are less hierarchical. The third is that they're less antisocial in various ways, so they'll behave in a less antisocial manner. And then the fourth is that they're less apt to produce economic inequality. So I'm going to go through and evaluate all 4 of those. And but first of all, there's just a little bit of background that I want to give. The reason why I wound up thinking about cooperatives in a more structured way was actually because I was doing work in business ethics and I was thinking about the corporation. And there's a lot of literature that's been developed in recent years that has shed a great deal of insight on the corporation that is actually motivated by the study of cooperatives. And in particular, so Henry Hansman's work, who's at Yale Law School, has been very influential for me. And what he tries to do is he tries to analyze the business corporation as a type of cooperative. Right? So a lot of people find that very eye-opening, and I've also found it eye-opening. And so cooperatives wind up being actually in some ways like, you can think more clearly about the corporation by starting with an understanding of a cooperative and then sort of translating over. And but one of the things that literature sort of impresses upon the reader is that there's actually a lot less of a difference between cooperatives and business corporations than we often assume. And in particular, if you interpret the corporation as a type of cooperative, it really kind of begs the question as to whether, like, what exactly the difference is. And then, of course, it makes it difficult to promise these sort of external benefits of the cooperative form. Like, how could cooperatives be so great if they're really not all that different from business corporations? So this is my picture here is the provocative hypothesis that I want to put forward, right? So it's this is a reference to the common saying that a squirrel is just a rat with better public relations. And so then the question I want to pose is whether or not the cooperative is just a corporation with better public relations, right? So if cooperatives aren't just sort of the squirrels of the realm of political economy. And I guess I kind of want to say yes, they are. All right, so the background to all this though is, again, so I come at this from the direction of sort of high theory and thinking in a very sort of abstract way about all these different organizational forms. And so a lot of this sort of new thinking about both the corporation and cooperatives is motivated by developments in corporate law in the 20th century. And perhaps the most important development in corporate law and then economic theories of the firm has been the kind of like growing acceptance of the so-called nexus of contracts view of the firm. Right? So the firm is a nexus of contracts. There's more and less controversial versions of that hypothesis. But so I'm going to present just the uncontroversial form of it, which I think pretty much everyone accepts. And so it involves this kind of a schema here where you see the corporation as involving 4 major constituencies, or sometimes they're called patron groups. I'm not going to call them stakeholder groups because that leads in a different direction. So I'll just call them constituencies. That every firm has 4 major constituencies. So first of all, there's suppliers who provide inputs to the firm, and then the customers who purchase the outputs. And then the firm engages in some kind of value-added activity that involves the combination of labor and capital. So you have workers supplying labor, and then lenders who are supplying capital, which is used to provide machinery and so forth. That generates the value-added process of the firm. And the crucial thing about the nexus of contracts view of the firm is just to say that, so what is the firm? Right? The firm is literally sort of the nexus of these contractual relations that exist amongst the 4 parties. So the highly reductionist version of this is to say that the firm's actually kind of an illusion. All 4 of these parties could just directly contract with one another. Right? And those contracts would be infernally complex. But you could kind of do pretty much anything that you can do with a firm, you could do with a complex set of contracts. Now, that's not entirely true, but like there's a very important point at stake there, which is to think, which it has to do with how you think about the firm, right? So think of the customers of the firm, right? The customers who purchase the outputs generate a revenue stream, right? So that revenue stream, that all three of the other constituencies have a claim on that revenue stream, right? So the workers are going to get part of it, the lenders are going to get part of it, providers of capital are going to get a part of it, and the suppliers are going to get a part of it. And in principle, those three parties could all contract with one another directly to develop a formula for how that revenue stream is going to be divided up amongst them, right? And what the firm does is it dramatically simplifies all that by creating a legal entity so that these parties, instead of having to contract with one another, can rather contract with the firm, right? So the workers enter into a contract that's specified, so their wages are getting paid out of that revenue stream. And so the wage contract is basically their claim on that portion of the revenue stream. The lenders are going to get paid interest on their loans, right? That's a contract that specifies what they get out of the revenue stream. And then the same thing with the suppliers, right? So that's what it means by the nexus, right? Is that it's obviously dramatically simplifying a set of in principle, complex contractual relations amongst these constituencies. So what's helpful about this is that it focuses on contracts as kind of the bread and butter of the firm, right? So what's happening really is that the firm is signing contracts with all these parties in order to allow them to engage in a form of team production in a way that legally dramatically simplifies their relations, right? So that's the kind of, so the background is that everybody's got a contract, right? And then there's one anomaly to that though, right? And the anomaly to it, if you focus on the standard business corporation, is there's one group that doesn't have a contract, right? So everybody's got their contracts with the exception of shareholders. Right? So the thing about shareholders is that they don't have that same contractual relation with the firm, right? So rather what they have is they have a residual claim on the firm's earnings, right? So they're not entitled to anything, but they get what's left over after all of the firm's contractual obligations have been met, right? So that's the residual claim. And then that is typically paired with then control of the firm. It doesn't have to be. And there's some, I mean, there's been lots of innovation in this space, right? So there's some arrangements that don't pair it with control. But typically the residual claim is coupled with formal control, which is the right to elect the board of directors, right? And then that, of course, means the right to appoint management, and therefore to have management exhibit partiality towards your interests, right? So the shareholders have this non-contractual relation with the firm, where they get they get a portion of the revenue stream, which is unspecified, and then they also get a vote, which allows them to get unspecified obligations of management. Okay, so that's like the big exception, and that's the character of ownership. Now, there has been historically, this may not seem like helpful, but this has actually been really important in political economy for clarifying a point that was really, really unclear in the 19th century and for a lot of the 20th century. That is that there was a background tendency when talking about the capitalist firm to kind of conflate provision of capital to the firm with exercising ownership of the firm. And so like the way Marx talked about the firm was the capitalist kind of owned the means of production, right? And that actually conflates two quite different things, right? Providing capital to the firm and then being the owner of the firm, right? And Marx wrote as if they always went together, and then in political economy, people often, so I actually try to avoid talking about the capitalist firm because it often just runs these two things together. But they don't have to go together. In particular, there are many people who provide capital to the firm who don't own the firm, right? So banks who give loans to the firm do not exercise ownership. Or a person who purchases a bond from a corporation, right? That they're providing capital to the firm, but they do not exercise ownership. Right? So the first thing is you can provide capital without being the owner. But secondly, you can also be the owner without providing capital. And the example of that then that people turn to is the cooperative. Right? So a cooperative is an example then of a type of firm whereby people exercise ownership of it, but they don't actually provide capital to the firm. Right? So there's many different flavors of cooperative, right? But so the classic example of this is like the one I think is kind of nice because it's very clear, is like a mutual insurance scheme. So my wife, for example, gets her disability, she's a physician, she gets her disability insurance through a mutual. run by the Ontario Medical Association. And the way that works is that she's a policyholder and she pays essentially an above market rate for her policy. And at the end of the year, she gets a refund. And along with that, she gets a vote over the board of directors. So then it's a consumer cooperative. And what makes her the owner is that, first of all, she gets control in the form of voting rights over the board. But secondly, also, she gets the residual claim. The residual claim now is not called profit, it's called a refund, right? But a refund is just that. It's all the money left over after all the contractual obligations of the firm has been met, right? So she's in structurally a very similar position to that of the shareholder, but she's getting that position, that ownership position, by virtue of being a customer, not by virtue of being a lender of the firm. So this is the thing that's the little piece where cooperatives really helped people thinking about corporate law to clarify their thinking about what a corporation is. So what you get is a sort of classic structure whereby what she's doing then is essentially, as a customer, she's providing her input on extremely easy terms to the firm, which is to say she's overpaying for her policy, right? So she's paying an above market rate for the policy. And in return, she gets control, loyalty of management, and a residual claim. So now if you take that picture and you apply it to shareholders, you can see that shareholders essentially occupy the same position with respect to the corporation, right? So think of a shareholder as like a bondholder, but rather who is supplying their input to the firm on extraordinarily easy terms, right? So the thing about, if you purchase a bond from a corporation, you're lending money to the company, and in return, you're getting a fixed interest rate with guaranteed, right? A guaranteed interest rate, and you're getting a fixed repayment date, right? So those are two things that as a lender you enjoy having. What a shareholder is doing is also providing a loan, the person who initially buys the share, right? They're providing capital to the firm, but in return, they're accepting a zero interest rate with no fixed repayment term, right? They're basically handing over money to the company. And so why would anybody do that? Is because of the value of the residual claim and the control of the board of directors, right? So the same way that the mutual insurance policy holder is contracting with the firm on easy terms, the shareholder is essentially lending to the corporation on extremely easy terms. All right, so this is the analysis of the cooperative. It's become highly influential. I think it's very persuasive. So if you think of it in terms of the constituencies, the analysis generates the familiar three flavors of cooperative. I'm ignoring multi-constituency, multi-stakeholder cooperatives for the moment, because they're a complicated case, right? But these are the really, really familiar types of cooperative. I put this up in part, this is less relevant to this group. I put this up often for philosophers to remind them that when we talk about the cooperative sector in general, the overwhelming percentage of cooperatives are actually consumer cooperatives. And so the number up there is up, like in North America, like approximately 90% of cooperatives are actually owned by their customers. And then the second most common is the supply cooperative, which then makes up about 9%. And then worker co-ops actually represent less than 1% of cooperatives, right? They're a very difficult organizational form to make. So if you look at all the cooperatives here, they're almost all customer cooperatives. And we were talking about this, like credit unions are a little bit tricky to classify. I'm including them as customer co-ops. So there's an interesting empirical question about why this winds up being the kind of empirical distribution that you see in the economy of cooperatives. But then if you actually just classify business corporations as a type of lender cooperative, you wind up with the kind of same pattern reproducing itself, right? Which is that people can choose how to organize their economic activities. The corporate form winds up being just simply a very, very popular way of organizing your economic activity. Right? So if you look out there, I mean, I'm not sure exactly. I mean, counting out how large the cooperative space in the economy is very, very tricky, right? But so like we can roughly schematize and say like about 90% then of firms are actually just business corporations or lender cooperatives, right? And then you've got like a big chunk of consumer cooperatives. And then you've got like very, very small percentage of the other two forms. Okay, so this is giving rise to like a really, really interesting literature about how ownership gets determined. And again, it's like important to emphasize, and those of you who sort of work on the empirical aspect of this may seem really obvious, but it's a lot less obvious to people who have a background more in theory and political economy, is that ultimately the structure that a firm takes is chosen by the constituencies that are involved in the firm. And it's possible for firms to change their structure. And so there are many circumstances in which firms that begin as cooperatives decide to transform into corporations. And demutualization in the insurance sector would be particularly high profile and important version of that. But also during COVID, the Mountain Equipment Co-op, went out of business and then got bought by private equity and came back as the Mountain Equipment Company, which doesn't have quite as much of a ring to it. But also there are many circumstances, less so in Canada, of capitalist firms, in particular, that are going bankrupt, getting bought out by their workers and then becoming worker co-ops and so forth. You can abstractly think of a group in these constituencies involved in team production, and it being a kind of open question what the structure should be of the organization, and in particular, which constituency should be exercising ownership. So there's been a really interesting empirical literature sort of addressing the question of why it is that the business corporation is so popular. And in particular, a lot of firms start out as partnerships, right? And when they're just developing, you think of a typical software startup or something like that, right? They're often either closely held corporations or partnerships, where often, by the way, in partnerships, they're actually kind of multi-constituency. You've often got investors and workers and all kinds of people, right? And then they decide that they're going to once they get large enough, they're going to sort of, formal. They outgrow the partnership structure, but at that point they can choose what they want to be. And in the vast majority of cases, what they choose is to become a business corporation, and so not a cooperative, right? So then the question is why they're choosing to become a business corporation. And so there's been a really interesting and useful discussion about what it is exactly that determines ownership. Right? And I'll just mention this because, again, there's a kind of overhang from 19th century discussions and Marxism and talk about the capitalist firm to imagine that there's something about corporate law that kind of forces people to have business corporations. And it's just really important to recognize that that's not true. People choose how they want to organize things. So the reason why there's so many corporations in the world is because economic actors have chosen that as their preferred mode of organization. So then the empirical question is why are they choosing that? And then of course, normatively, from the standpoint of the cooperative movement, you want to ask, well, and is there a way to make the cooperative form more attractive so that more people will choose that form? All right, so then the general view on why people are choosing that is to say, if you imagine then, on my diagram of the four constituencies, ownership can go to any one of them, right? And so the question is which one is prepared to outbid the other ones for ownership of the firm? And that's going to be determined by how much they stand to gain from owning the firm. And how much they stand to gain from owning the firm is going to be a function of three different things. So the first is how much they are going to directly benefit from exercising ownership. And it's important to recognize that, so when I talk about benefit, it's always net benefit, right? Because it's very clear that there's costs associated with ownership, and then there are benefits associated with ownership, right? So there are benefits associated with having the residual claim, but there's an obvious cost associated with having the residual claim, which is that the residual claimant is the first to absorb any losses, right? So there's a heightened level of risk exposure associated with being the residual claimant. But then obviously there's the possibility of appropriating windfall profits, which is the possible upside, right? Being the owner means that you have to exercise firm governance, right? So then you have to start, paying attention to what goes on the board and how you're going to vote on various questions and so on and so forth. Okay. All right. So the thought then is that in each of these, all right. So there's benefits of ownership. Then there's the benefit / costs of having to contract with every other group. Right. So if group A is the owner, that means that you have to have contracts with B, C, and D. Right. And that can be either more or less beneficial. And so part of the benefit of you being the owner is how much of a cost you acquire in your contracting relations with everybody else. And then the third category is just kind of how good they are at doing the owning, how good they are at exercising ownership in terms of the overall productivity of the firm. right? So that is like, are they able to exercise effective governance? Are they able to effectively supervise management? And if they are, then that means the firm will be prosperous and that there are benefits that can be derived from them. All right, so the thought is that lenders, investors have a kind of like generic advantage in all three of these categories over the other three ownership groups, right? So the generic, it's just a consequence of their specific contribution to the firm, like money, right? So like the fact that they're lending money to the firm gives them this kind of generic advantage. So the first generic advantage on the benefits of ownership and or the costs of ownership is that, like, so the major cost of ownership is the risk exposure that comes from being the residual claimant. Investors are typically the ones best positioned to accept that risk exposure because they're the constituency that's able to diversify most easily, right? In other words, investors can hedge the risk associated with being invested in a particular firm by investing in a bunch of other firms, right? Workers are typically thought to be the worst when it comes to that risk exposure because they work for one firm, right? They're all in with that one company. They're not able to diversify, right? Customers are in between, as are suppliers when it comes to diversification. But investors have this kind of generic advantage over all other constituencies, is that they can mitigate a lot of the risks by diversification. Second, then the costs of contracting. So obviously, if you're the owner, that means you have to have contracts with everybody else. One of the generic advantages of having investors owning the firm is that the capital that is provided in the form of equity can be easily used as collateral to secure additional credit, right? So that is, you get leveraging of the capital, right? So shareholders provide equity. Equity serves as collateral. Collateral means that your cost of getting credit through contract declines, right? So in other words, capitalist firms, I shouldn't say capitalist firms, standard business corporations are able to get bank loans at much lower interest rates because they have an all-purpose form of collateral that can be pledged against those loans, right? Whereas other forms of cooperative have like much greater difficulty acquiring credit. And then third, in terms of the general firm benefits, now this is like the more subtle one. Investors have, again, a kind of generic advantage, which is that their interest positions tend to be extremely homogeneous, right? So that is, there are not many conflicts of interest amongst investors, right? Investors all want to make money, right? And so they're able to impose like bottom line accounting on the firm. And all investors can look at that and say, oh, am I getting my money's worth out of this? And so it's easy to measure the benefit that they're getting, and most of them share the same interest. And by the way, which is not to diminish the conflicts of interest that can exist among shareholders. All I want to say is that compared to other constituencies, shareholders typically have like the fewest conflicts of interest. And so one of the observations that's been made about cooperatives and when cooperatives succeed is that cooperatives tend to succeed more readily in areas in which their ownership are all sort of identically situated in their relations to the firm. So like worker cooperatives, for example, are most successful when all workers are doing exactly the same job. So once you have a complex division of labor, like say United Airlines is a good example of this, where you had 3 different classes of employees and 3 different classes of 3 different unions representing those employees. And then they took over the firm, right? Then what happens is you've got a built-in recipe for conflict there because the employees have different interests, right? So should you spend money to buy new airplanes? The mechanics say yes, you know, like the flight crew says no, right? I mean, you know, so there's conflict there, right? Whereas investors are typically all on the same page. As a result, they are able to more effectively discipline the management of the firm, because the management is not able to play divide and conquer against the owners, because the owners all have the same interests. And so technically speaking, you have fewer multi-principal and you have fewer multi-principal and multitask agency problems arising in the investor-owned firms than you do in the cooperative firm. All right, so these are not, like, so this is just at the realm of theory. there's a kind of generic advantage that the investors have over all of the other constituencies. So when it comes to exercising governance of the firm. And so that's why often the default is the business corporation, because if nothing but standard circumstances prevail, both in the market and in the firm, typically the investors are going to be best positioned to derive the greatest benefit from ownership. So they're going to be willing to outbid everybody else for ownership. So where you do see cooperatives being successful, it's often because slightly non-standard circumstances prevail. And so, in other words, because they're not able to diversify away risk, exercising ownership is usually only favored when there are particularly large benefits to be achieved through ownership. And so, for example, I think like the classic farm supply cooperative fits this model, whereby in general, like it's better, like investors are in a better position to accept the risks of ownership. But in circumstances in which you have significant market power over customers, right? So like a firm is a monopolist, right? Then the customers wind up being potentially taken advantage of by an investor-owned firm. So then they have an incentive to form a customer co-op, because then through exercising ownership, they're able to get the loyalty of management. So even though they have greater risk exposure than investors would have, right? That's mitigated by the fact that they get a much more significant advantage from owning the firm in a sector that's been monopolized. And so that's why you often see customer co-ops developing in firms that are less than fully competitive. Okay, so this is just sort of like how you run through the analysis then of like why cooperatives are successful. So there's been like a really rich discussion. There was a while when people had thought, oh, like the whole system is kind of rigged against cooperatives, right? And that somehow there's like this unfair advantage enjoyed by capitalist firms. And that was kind of eroded by the observation that there's lots of sectors where cooperatives seem to do quite well. And there are also lots of sectors in which cooperatives compete head-to-head against capitalist firms extremely successfully. Right? So it can't be that the system is completely rigged against them. So then the question is like, oh, then what is like what is special about the markets in which cooperatives are thriving that allows them to thrive in these markets in cases where like they're not thriving in other markets, right? So like, why are there co-op taxis, but there are practically no co-op restaurants, right? Like restaurants are not particularly capital intensive, right? Why are there no cooperative restaurants, right? And there are taxis or travel agencies and stuff like that, or plywood manufacturing facilities and stuff like that, like cooperatives. All right, so this is the style analysis that has come to predominate that I find fairly persuasive. But I guess I should say that one of the characteristics of the style of analysis is it makes cooperatives look a lot like capitalist firms, right? So really it's just a question of you've got these four options in terms of ownership. And then the question is who should own it? And that kind of gets decided by the parties. And the party that's got the most important interest at stake is typically the ones that's going to win the contest for ownership. And so that's what determines the preponderance of capitalist firms. All right, so that analysis, which I find sort of attractive on its merits, but it also has the implication that cooperatives are not going to be all that different from standard business corporations. And so that we should perhaps be cautious in over-ascribing virtue to people. Okay, so here's my little, the upshot of all this is that the factors that I mentioned, like in standard circumstances, they favor business corporations. And so usually there's like a special circumstance that explains the particular success of a co-op. Okay, so now the commonly cited virtues of cooperatives. Again, I want to emphasize that, so one of the things that's totally clear from this analysis is that cooperatives generate benefits for their members, very significant benefits for their members. That's why their members are members, is because of the benefits that are being generated for them. So it's kind of like a priori, right, that cooperatives generate benefits for their members. And so what I want to ask though is whether they generate benefits for society in general. And here I have to say, like, I'm not particularly like optimistic about those possibilities. So the first is that the cooperatives are often pointed to as being more democratic than the business corporation. And I should say that in the philosophical literature, like in my corner of the woods, what people are usually interested in is democracy for the workers. right? So there's been a huge literature developing on workplace democracy. And so here actually, this actually is not relevant to most cooperatives in the sense that if what they're worried about in the firm is that it's not sufficiently democratic with respect to its workers, then supply cooperatives and consumer cooperatives have nothing to offer because supply and consumer cooperatives are equally undemocratic with respect to their workers. So I think the proper way to look at it, and there's also like a temptation to categorize the business corporation as undemocratic. Which is, I always think like is an odd characterization because the standard business corporation is democratic in exactly the same way that a customer co-op is democratic or a supply co-op is democratic, which is that the owners get democratic control over the firm, right? And so business corporations are democratic because the shareholders democratically elect the board of directors, right? Not because they're the shareholders, but because they're the owners of the firm. Right? And in a customer co-op, it's the customers who democratically control the board of directors. Right? Now, in all of those organizational forms, workers don't get democratic say over their conditions of employment, not because they're workers, it's because they're not the owners. Right? And so, so the standard argument that focuses on worker democracy is only relevant and only favors worker co-ops, which, as we've seen, represent a very, very small fraction of the cooperative sector. So I often challenge people who are really keen to this stuff to like then stop talking about business corporations and just take like a supply co-op and like, do you want that to be a worker democracy as well? Like, is it unjust to workers that they're not able to have a vote at like the co-op or something like that? Okay, so that's one argument that I think is like not particularly compelling, and the proper answer is to say that all of these firm types are democratic and that the standard business corporation is democratic. It's just that in all these circumstances, it's only the owners who get democratic say. The second point then has to do with this does apply to all co-ops, but often the fact that co-ops often function on a one member, one vote rule is seen as being more democratic than the voting per share rule. And this does apply. So this would, according to this criteria, supply and customer co-ops that use this rule would be construed as more democratic. It certainly is a characteristic of the business corporation that it's not like one investor, one vote, rather it's the one share, one vote. And so as far as that's concerned, all I want to say is that I've never really seen the argument as to why that is somehow more democratic. It's clearly more closely resembles the way political democracy functions. Right? So when it comes to our democratic citizenry, every citizen gets a single vote. But that doesn't mean that necessarily in every firm it becomes more democratic that every person, like that has to be the unit. And so typically, and so the first kind of cheap argument that just to observe is that a lot of co-ops don't respect that principle. That there's no requirement that that it has to be one member, one vote. Some co-ops have that rule. There's nothing to stop you from organizing a business corporation to have that rule as well. And in fact, like the plywood cooperatives are in fact standard business corporations, and they also have a one member, one vote rule, but that's because you're only allowed to own one share, right? And so like you could make shares that would impose that rule on a business corporation, and you can also organize your cooperative so it doesn't follow that. So I own an apartment in a New York cooperative, and there I don't have equal voting with everybody else. I own a certain number of shares based on the size of my apartment. And the people with bigger apartments own more shares, and they pay more, and they also get more votes than I get, right? So it's just not true that cooperatives uniformly respect this supposedly more democratic principle. Second, cooperatives are often seen as less hierarchical. Again, like this is a concern that really focuses on worker co-ops, and I should say that when we talk about cooperatives, we should almost like break up the literature and be more specific about what we're talking about. Because like at this center, like worker co-ops are not like the central preoccupation, simply because worker co-ops are kind of rare. And they loom incredibly large in the philosophical and political economy discussion in a way that's completely disproportionate to the number of actual functioning worker co-ops that exist, right? So like I hear a lot about Mondragon in my day-to-day work, and I hear a lot less about the co-op, right? So the thought then is that that in a classic business corporation, that workers are subject to hierarchical control by management, and they have no say under the conditions, so they're bossed around and so forth. And often now it's become popular to suggest that they're dominated in such firms. And I guess all I would want to say is that this would also equally be an indictment of supply and consumer co-ops, right? Because in those cooperatives, workers are subject to exactly the same working conditions. Because they're not the owners, right? The board is elected by the members appoint the management, and management is not accountable to the workers. So this winds up being an argument specifically for worker co-ops, not for co-ops generally. And I guess all I would say about that is that worker co-ops are also subject to like a really, really well-known problem. So nowadays it's commonly referred to as the degeneration problem. But rather that worker co-ops over time tend to develop two classes of members. And so worker co-ops necessarily have closed membership. And the problem with worker co-ops is that they stop wanting to admit new members long before they reach the point at which their marginal costs are equal to their marginal revenue. Why? Because they're trying to maximize their profit share, right? And if you hire the way a business corporation does, right until you reach the margin, you're going to wind up depressing your profit share. And so worker co-ops have an economic incentive to stop bringing in new members at a certain point. But, I'm picturing the graph, right? There's still a whole space there where the firm could still profitably hire new workers, and other workers on the market would be more than happy to take that employment. And so it's just a structural feature of worker co-ops that they have an incentive to restrict their membership and to continue hiring new classes of labor, right? So and so this was like if you look at Beatrice Potter's like indictment of producer cooperatives in the 19th century, it's exactly the complaint that she had, right? Is that they generate hierarchy within the working class. An intuitive example of it is a law firm. So a law firm is technically a partnership, but it's in effect it's a worker co-op. Right, and you can see how the partners don't want to admit a new partner, and they explicitly say this: we're not going to admit a new partner unless that person is going to raise the average revenue experienced by the partners, right? So there's going to increase the average profits. Otherwise, we're not going to let them in. But there's still lots of work that can be done, so they hire associates. So every law firm is like a worker co-op that has a little core of members who are receiving a profit share, right? And then they've got workers, right, the associates, right, who are then working essentially on a fixed salary with the hope of someday becoming partners, right? So lots of worker co-ops have that structure, and it's just important to recognize that it's not something you can fix by ideology. Like it's part of like the most basic incentive structure of the worker co-op. So it's the reason why people were complaining about this in 1850, and people are still complaining about it, because I don't know if you know, but Mondragon has degenerated. So that Mondragon now has more non-member workers than member workers, right? Mondragon is about 35,000 member workers and about 45,000 non-member workers. And so people like want to, but like people are following the incentives, right? So as far as hierarchy goes, it's kind of like a mixed bag what happens with cooperatives and hierarchy. Okay, there's a hope that cooperatives will be less antisocial than capitalist firms. So I wrote another article that some people here have read about profit, and about how every time a company does something bad, people blame corporate greed, and they imagine that if the firm was not oriented towards profit, it would not be engaging in these activities. So firms produce externalities, and then the kind of folk explanation for that is, oh, it's because they're pursuing profit. And then the thought was that cooperatives might somehow be different. So like the obvious and easy answer to that is just to say, well, cooperatives are just as interested in profit as corporations are. Profit doesn't always get called profit. It often gets called a refund, or it gets called a share, or it gets called whatever, right? Or often it takes the form of qualitative goods, right? So it's not necessarily paid out in money. Customer co-op often provides higher service or higher quality goods. But that's also like a residual claim, right? So profit is a way of talking about a residual claim, right? Every single cooperative has an ownership group that's appropriating the residual claim, right? Groups that don't, so Firms that don't have an ownership group appropriating the residual claim are called nonprofits. Right? And that's what a nonprofit is a firm that no one's allowed to appropriate the residual claim. Right? So cooperatives are obviously profit oriented, but so I say that's like the kind of cheap and fast argument. The deeper observation is that externalities, so think of like antisocial behavior like pollution or something like that as an externality. Externalities are not caused by organizational objectives. They're caused by the decentralization of decision making. That is, whenever you break up decision making into a bunch of different groups, right, and you then give them each a mandate to pursue a particular goal, they're going to start generating externalities for each other. Right? So this is an observation that Alec Nove made a long time ago about the way Soviet economy worked. It's an observation that Stiglitz has made. It's an observation that every single university professor should instantly recognize, because academic departments are constantly generating externalities for other academic departments, right? You want a new budget line for a new faculty. Really? What's that going to do to the history department? Who cares what that does to the history department, right? Or to the English department, whatever, right? Like, everybody makes decisions to maximize the benefit of their unit within a bureaucracy with no interest in the impact that it has on other parts of the bureaucracy. That's an externality. And so it's not caused by, we're not pursuing profit, right? It's caused by decentralized decision making. And so as soon as you bite the bullet and say, we're going to have a market, you commit yourself to there being a lot of externalities. So cooperatives obviously have to be regulated exactly the same way that corporations have to be regulated, because they have exactly the same incentives to produce externalities. And nobody seriously wants to restructure things to eliminate decentralization. And therefore, it's going to be a fact of life. So then the exception would be in cases where the membership of the cooperative would be directly affected by the externality in question. Right, so there are some important cases, like moving the headquarters, like capriciously, is the kind of thing that business corporations do that cooperatives are far less likely to do. Right, so localized externalities that affect the community are less likely to be generated by cooperatives. But there's an important class of externalities, like say climate change, where cooperatives are really identically situated vis-a-vis corporations, in that there's an extremely diffuse externality that affects everybody, and therefore there's no particular incentive to reduce it. So there's no significant grounds for optimism there. And then the last thing I want to say, although this is something that is an interesting empirical question that I don't know the answer to, is that often in the literature, limited liability gets blamed for the tendency of business corporations to externalize. But my understanding is that cooperatives also enjoy limited liability. And so again, there's no difference between the two organizational forms. Okay, I'll wrap it up. I'm aiming to 5. Yeah. So the last one then is economic inequality. And so so you get this like extremes of inequality developing within the capitalist firm. I'm supposed to stop saying that. Okay, within the standard business corporation, you get a lot of inequality, and both amongst classes of workers and between management and workers. And the thought/hope is that cooperatives would generate less of that. So that's a complicated issue. I guess I would start by saying there is an economically fallacious argument that sometimes gets made that I just want to flag, which is that sometimes people treat profit as though there's a kind of pure waste involved in letting investors appropriate profits. So that if you cut out investors, suddenly all those profits become like available to be divided up amongst the other groups. And so that's an illusion caused by the fact that shareholders are making a zero interest loan with no repayment terms to the firm. Right? In other words, they're providing their input on extremely easy terms. Right? The only reason they're doing that is because they get the residual claim and control of the firm. So then if you take your lenders and say, okay, you're not going to get any of that stuff anymore, then nobody's going to be making zero interest loans to your firm anymore, right? So you're going to be going to lenders. And so you're going to be going to a bank, or you're going to be going to bondholders or whatever, right? And there's going to be a cost of capital there, right? So the profits, right? So you're paying out 8% profits, right? And so then you get rid of shareholders. It's suddenly like, it's not 8% is now gravy that can be spread liberally amongst the other groups, okay? Immediately, you're gonna have to go to a bank to get a loan, which, let's say you've got collateral, you're gonna be paying 5%, right? So it's only like the 3% that's gravy now that can be redistributed. The 5% is going to cover the cost of contract. Typically what happens is your costs of contracting are actually going up significantly. And so you're not even going to get the bonus. But if you get it, it's going to be just the equity premium is going to become available for redistribution, not the whole profit share. So I just want to draw attention to that because it's a common fallacy. That equity share, of course, then is the risk premium. Shareholders were sharing the risk. Now, so if you have to go out there and buy insurance because your members are not willing to bear the risks that shareholders were bearing, then that also has a cost, right? So you find that it easily gets eaten up pretty quickly, those profits. So that's just a fallacious argument. What I want to say about economic equality is that two things about cooperatives. So first of all, cooperatives have greater wage compression than business corporations do, which is to say, if you look at wages across the entire organization, they're flatter. And then secondly, the management to employee ratio is also, like, wage ratio is lower in cooperatives. So there's greater discipline on managerial compensation. So then, all of which is important. I just want to make two observations about it. The outrageous ratios that exist in the United States between management compensation and shareholder compensation is widely thought to be a consequence of a kind of exploitation of the owners by managers. Because if you look at jurisdictions where firms rely much more heavily on banks for their financing, you get much, much lower ratios between management compensation and average employee compensation. So Mondragon has a fixed ceiling of 6-to-1, which is the highest ratio that can develop between managers and workers. But if you look at Japan, for example, the ratio is 12-to-1 between managers and workers, which is not significantly higher. I mean, in America, it's like 400-to-1 or something like that, right? But that's because Japanese firms rely much more heavily on banks for their financing. And so you don't have the diffusion of ownership that allows managers to exploit shareholders. Germany as well has much, much lower ratios, in part because German firms rely much more heavily on bank financing. So cooperatives obviously are going to be relying more heavily on bank financing. So you would expect lower ratios, but it's not so obvious that it's the cooperative form that's doing it rather than the bank financing that's doing it. But also, like, it's not as though business corporations want to have these crazy ratios. It's because it's an example of shareholders failing to exercise effective governance over managers. Right. And so in order for cooperatives to start to keep the same, like, control over that ratio, the owners of the cooperative also have to be able to govern the firm effectively, which means that they have to be able to exercise sufficient discipline on management. And when cooperatives are in, like, a particular sector where they suffer a kind of an advantageous selection of people who are ideologically committed to the cooperative movement, right? That could be relatively easy to do. But if you were to generalize the model to broader segments of the economy, you might start seeing, like, a lot more strategic and instrumental behavior. And then it's not really, really clear exactly how cooperatives are going to be able to do a better job disciplining their managers than corporations are doing. And then so that's like one not totally obvious point. And then the second less than fully obvious point is that if you have a lot of wage compression within the firm, right, and business corporations also have wage compression. And so it's important to recognize that, like, somebody doing a particular job inside a corporation, two different jobs, there's going to be less of a wage differential than if those individuals are market contracting and existing separate firms. So wage compression represents one of the transaction costs of using the firm to organize production, and it generates an incentive to outsource. Right? So if you've got an organization with a lot of wage compression, that means some people are making a lot less and some people are making a lot more than their market wage. Right? So there's a huge incentive to outsource the tasks of people who are making a lot more than the market wage when they're in the firm. Right? So while it may be true that there's wage compression and therefore less economic inequality in a cooperative, assuming a decentralized market economy, it also limits the possible scale of cooperatives by creating greater returns to outsourcing certain kinds of functions. And so if you think through the consequences of it, it's just not obvious that cooperatives would actually do a particularly have a significant impact on reducing economic inequality either. Okay, so let me just quickly wrap up and say so I think it's like there's a lot to be said for cooperatives, and there's also a lot, I think, of like there are many circumstances in which individuals are clearly being taken advantage of in various ways by business corporations, and the formation of a cooperative is an effective way for them to redress the situation. And to the extent that corporate law, still favors business corporations, or that there are sort of unnecessary transaction costs and obstacles to the creation of cooperatives, I think there's a lot to be said for making it easier to form cooperatives. I think there's also significant returns to thinking in this way about governance within cooperatives and how that can be made more effective so that they're able to compete more effectively with capitalist firms, right? Why? The reason I think this is all important is because cooperatives generate benefits for their members, right? And there's a lot to be said for having an organization type that drives those types of benefits. But where I'm skeptical is the thought that those of us who are just bystanders observing this entire thing are going to realize any kind of significant benefit from this transformation of the economy. So there, I'm sorry to say, it's like the ultimate skeptical perspective of why I don't actually think, what was the title? That cooperatives are more virtuous than corporations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joe. We're gonna have a lot to talk about over supper. And any questions for Joe? I've got a whole bunch of them up here. Let's open it up online. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, geez, I got these things.
The online folks.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Now it's intimidating. All right. Well, thanks so much for the talk. It was very, very informative, and always it's good to hear a contrarian type of perspective. I guess I had a question a bit about. I want to talk more about the state. Not so much the state as an owner. We can leave that out. But is there maybe ways for the state to create regulation to make cooperatives more virtuous? Number one, and number two, if the state could make cooperatives more virtuous, is there a way for the state to maybe, tip the scales in favor of the cooperatives a bit? I know Saskatchewan CCF-NDP has always tried to do that when it's become government and in control of the state and actually has had troubles doing it. But there's a way for the state to not only to make cooperatives more virtuous, but possibly also promote their existence and their creation. And maybe could some sort of pause role of the state make you, I guess, a bit less skeptical about the positive role that the cooperatives could play within the economy?
Yeah. Well, let me just say, first of all, the suggestion that the state should be promoting cooperatives seems to be to presuppose the falsity of the thesis I've been defending. Right? That is that society has something at stake in the question of it. Like if it were true that having more cooperatives, meant that there was less pollution, right? Or meant that there was less economic inequality, then that would give the state a kind of an interest in promoting that type of organizational form. But if it's not the case that cooperatives, reduce pollution or reduce economic inequality, then it's not clear what interest the state has in the area. Now, there have been certain initiatives where the state has intervened to try to promote cooperative formation. So in Ontario, for example, I just happen to know a lot about electricity generation cooperatives because the province had a program to try to promote consumer co-ops in the renewable energy space. But there was a specific reason for that, was that they were running into social license problem with all the windmills that they were installing, right? And so the idea was to get community buy-in, was you would form the consumer cooperative, and that would make it so that you didn't have like litigious farmers complaining about their sight lines being destroyed and stuff like that. So there was a specific motivation for wanting to do it, but it had to do with kind of social acceptance. I think the UK has done something really, really similar, where they're trying to avoid renewable backlash, right? The only thing I would say is that, so that's the specific thing. The first point I want to make is something that took me a while to realize, though, is that there's an argument to be made that the state already dramatically privileges cooperatives by treating their profits differently from the profits of corporations, right? Which is to say that if you look at the residual claim in a business corporation, it gets taxed as corporate profit. It gets taxed once in the hand of the corporation, and then gets taxed again in the hands of when the dividends are paid to shareholders. Whereas cooperatives, in general, possibly across the board, the residual claim that they're paying out to members gets treated as a business expense. Right, so cooperatives are typically taxed on their profits, but they're typically able to reduce their profits to zero by paying out the profits in the form of an expensible claim. So for example, like the refund paid out to members in a mutual insurance corporation is basically a profit, right? But it's treated as a business expense. So that's actually a non-negligible tax advantage. But in fact, there's an interesting case. So Brazil has had this problem of like corrupt cooperatives, where they made it a little bit too easy to form a cooperative. And because cooperatives have these very significant tax advantages, firms were like taking all their workers and like turning them into a cooperative and then outsourcing employment to the co-op. And it was all like a tax ruse or whatever. So all I should say is that there actually is like a gigantic tax advantage to forming a cooperative, to the point where I'm surprised that businesses don't more often like set up a sham cooperative in order to avoid taxes. But so that having been said, so again, that just like if you go back to like the slide I was saying about like these advantages here, right? Given the fact that you've got the extra taxation on dividend payments, right? This actually shows like what an uphill battle it is to overcome the advantage that investors have. Is like even with the excess tax burden on the corporation, you still have this form dominantly funded. So, and then sorry, I'm going on, but the last thing I would say is that I'm just reading up on this in preparation for the talk. I came across this kind of neat move though, towards homogenization of corporate law, where people have been trying, some jurisdictions already have this, but like a lot of co-ops are actually incorporated as business corporations. And then they have special restrictions on their shares that generate a cooperative form. So people have been argued that rather than having separate cooperative incorporation statutes and a business one, and then also with like B Corps and benefit corporations, like corporate law is getting more flexible. There are people who've argued that the best way to ensure neutrality is actually to get rid of the distinction entirely at law, and then just have a generic incorporation statute, and then have a bunch of different bylaw options that will allow you to choose whether or not you're going to be a business corporation or a cooperative. And then I think it would be a lot easier to, like there are arbitrary restrictions on cooperative formation. In particular, some jurisdictions have rules on like what percentage of your business has to be with your own members and stuff like that, that are kind of arbitrary and restrict cooperatives. So one way to get rid of that would be to actually collapse the distinction in law between the two organizational forms, which I think is a really neat idea.
So I'm going to use my moderator prerogative here, Joe, to weigh in a little bit. I'm not sure I'm able to pose this as a question because there's a few factual things I want to challenge. You just said what you're referring to is the patronage rebate clause. It's actually, I think it's section 137, the act, and it's actually universally applicable. So
of which act?
Of the income tax act.
Of the
any firm can make use of the patronage claim. If they just don't, they have no interest in returning rebates to their customers because the customers are not the owners, they're not the patrons. There's an alignment between the ownership and the benefit in the cooperative that you don't see in the difference. So that's a point. I used to work in financing. This is an issue that came up all the time.
I see that.
So it was a misplaced argument, but well out there, but wrong. The other way that I'd actually say the tax system advantages the investor-owned firm in all sorts of ways that are hard to see, but are out there if you look at the tax act. So for example, capital gains taxation. Credit unions, cooperatives can't benefit from capital gains taxation. Lower inclusion rates, I mean 50%, it's going to 2/3.
Right.
So that's a major funding advantage that incentivizes and helps address all these costs of ownership questions that you're raising. That again, the system, it's very hard to see if you're not in the policy space. But the system, and I've worked and sat at those tables, and you wouldn't believe how the system structurally advantages publicly traded.
Right.
And so this is where I mean, we're a pragmatic institution, but it's important to connect the theory with the reality. And I think there's a bit of a gap there. So I'd be interested in your response to that.
Yeah.
That's not just the GST, HST.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of mechanisms that are leaning one way,
Right.
to scale this way.
Yeah, and that, I mean, so that's one of the reasons I was keen to come and talk to people who understand the nuts and bolts of these things, because that seems to be like the interesting and productive conversation to be had about these questions.
Yeah.
Right? like, if there are specific disadvantages, what are those specific disadvantages? And so, like, in my world, the kinds of disadvantages that get pointed to are these kind of red herrings.
Right.
About, oh, you have to pay more for your bank loans.
Right.
Which is kind of like structural, like, yes, of course, you have to pay more for your bank loans. And you don't get the benefits of having shareholders and you get, and kick them out, right?
Yeah.
Like, you kick out your shareholders, you don't get the benefits of having shareholders, right? So anyhow, so yeah, so I find it frustrating that there's a discussion that happens at abstract level about these advantages. And so, yeah, I bring up the tax thing, which is obviously the more complicated thought, just to point out that it's not like a no-brainer though, figuring out whether or not corporate law is advantaging or disadvantaging.
So just a quick knock on to this, and I have some questions here, but you can look at jurisdictions where the environment seems to select much more favorably for co-ops. And part of it is through the tax mechanisms, but other mechanisms as well, that I think would kind of level the playing field. I think in some ways, my argument aligns with yours. And I'd say there's a lot of disadvantages to the co-op form in our institutional structures. And then if you look at jurisdictions that have less of that, you see a different outcome on that ratio.
Yeah.
So just an observation. I have a question here. If we take the perspective that co-ops are often used as a tool when the state downloads responsibility to solve public problems. So you mentioned one around renewable energy, that's sort of a public problem. Affordable housing or childcare, not just businesses. Could the argument be made that co-ops provide a more virtuous, service-focused alternative to profit-oriented solutions like purpose-built rentals? I use the housing as the example as the largest sector where co-ops operate in Canada. So do you see any merit in that from that virtuous perspective or not virtuous perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one of the other tricks, so I didn't really talk about public sector versus co-ops, right? So I'm talking about corporation versus co-op. So public sector versus co-ops, there's a discussion as well. And so it's interesting in the case of housing. I mean, because one of the things about co-ops is that they also have kind of complex relations with unions, right? And so, like, one of the major motivations for privatization in general is the sort of an attempt to do an end run around public sector unions. And so, like, in the housing co-op, I actually don't know nearly enough about housing cooperatives. But but living in Toronto, we certainly get to pay a lot of attention to municipally owned property. And there, like, the overwhelming difficulty is the behavior of public sector unions. And in particular with municipalities, it's particularly difficult because they cannot enact back to work legislation. So provinces and the federal government have a kind of stick that they can use to control their unions, whereas municipalities often don't have such a stick. They have to rely on the province. So if you look at the province in the Toronto Municipal Housing Corporation, which is the second largest publicly owned housing system in Canada, or in North America, sorry. I mean, so we're second to New York in terms of the amount of public housing we have, right? But it has a lot of enormous difficulties around getting, like, maintenance repairs done because of, like, job restrictions that are imposed on their unions. And so I'm really, really curious, like, if you outsource it to cooperatives, right, then what exactly the status is of them and their unions? I would be curious to know.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I'd say a lot of these are essentially not-for-profit co-ops too, right? That's the other qualifier, right? So the childcare co-ops, the housing co-ops, less of a profit pursuit than the kind of consumer producer.
Yeah. I mean, I think childcare co-ops are a really neat example as well, because so there's a sector where business corporations have been extremely unsuccessful, right? And there, I think that's all about the agency problems, which is that people don't trust for-profit firms to look after their kids, right? And so one of the reasons for the undersupply of daycare in general is that you've got a market failure caused by the standard governance model not being attractive. So where you tend to get daycares is either nonprofits or cooperatives. And the problem then with nonprofits is that they have no incentive to expand capacity. So you end up supply restrictions. And then so my kids went to daycare at a not-for-profit university daycare right next to a co-op daycare. And so I got to, like, be privy to all the sort of drama around governance of the cooperative daycare. So cooperative daycare, though, also has this kind of interesting governance challenge, which is it's like the finitely repeated Prisoner's Dilemma, is everybody knows when they're out, right? Like, you just count the age of your kid and you know when you're checking out. And so the incentive to get invested in governance is really, really poor. Right? Because like if you're not planning to have more kids, then you're only in for 2 more years, something like that. So you can live with bad governance until you check out. So they have a structural governance problem from the fact that their members move through, right, with such predictability. So I think the daycare space is kind of interesting, and sort of advertisement for this kind of model way of thinking about it is that there you have a situation in which kind of no model actually works well, which I actually think is the primary argument for public sector involvement in daycare, right? Is because co-op, I mean, so like the corporate daycare, people don't want, right? But co-op daycare also has like really serious structural problems in the ownership relation, including nonprofit daycare. So that's the argument for the public sector in that case.
We have a question over here. Go ahead.
I wanted to find out what is the ultimate utility or objective of co-op, and what is the ultimate utility or objective of cooperative as these.
Yeah, and I think that's the crucial thing is it's to provide. I mean, it's a little tricky, but it's roughly speaking to provide benefits for its members. And I mean, so one of the things that bothers people about the business corporation is its partiality. Right? That is that you have the management of the firm is committed to not the general good, but rather to advancing the interests of its owners, right? So the shareholders. And so there's a kind of populist view that says the reason corporations do bad things is because they're not committed to the general interest. They're only committed to advancing the interests of their members. Right? So, I mean, one of the most basic observations I want to make is just that cooperatives have exactly the same structure. It's just that they have a different set of owners, right? And so, so I have this. My last book I published with a worker co-op, Friesen Press in Winnipeg, right? And so I kind of use it to a bunch of my colleagues because I say, oh, because they're writing all their anti-capitalist books and they're publishing them with like global multinational firms, right? Whereas I'm over here publishing with a worker co-op. But the important thing is that as an author, I'm not part of the ownership group of either group. So how I get treated as an author by a capitalist firm is actually not that much better or worse than the way I got treated by the worker co-op, because in both cases the firm exists to advance the interest of its members, and as an author I'm just a supplier, right? So I'm not a member. But when I did talk to the Writers Guild of Canada, or when I talked to Access Copyright, those are organizations that are writers organizations, and then of course I have this solicitous management who's interested in my interests, right? Well, like Access Copyright's a good example. So the Canadian Copyright Licensing Agency is a good example. So it's a nonprofit, but it serves copyright holders. So I get all these emails and they're like bulldogs on copyright, which I kind of appreciate because I get monthly checks from them, right? But on the other hand, as a university professor, I'm kind of like on the fence, right? Because I like to freely distribute stuff amongst my students, right? But the point about Access Copyright is that they serve their members, right? And in that case, it's copyright holders, right? So I don't want to glamorize what they do, right? They're not interested in the general interest. They're interested in copyright holders.
So we have another question, but I just want to say something. As somebody who started a daycare co-op, I would argue that the governance costs are trivial relative to the benefits of having your child raised in a safety kind of good environment. So it's actually an application of what you're talking about, I think. And so, question over here.
Thanks, Joe. That's a really interesting talk, and I have never thought about what a corporation was, and I come to this sort of free of empirical knowledge about how these things work. So I just wanted to ask a question about the structure of your argument, because your suggestion is that, well, really, you're bringing up examples of cases where cooperatives maybe are engaged in antisocial behavior or non-democratic behavior and so on. But that doesn't show us that they're less democratic than corporations. It shows, right, to make that case, you would have to mount more evidence and so on. Because few instances of it don't make your case. So then I'm thinking about examples like food and corporations promoting food deserts in order to advance their interests. And kind of assuming that cooperatives aren't gonna have that ambition. And so then I guess I'm wondering if you could if you could say more maybe to convince about them being equally as vicious as corporations, or I mean, maybe that's too much to ask you to do in a presentation.
No, but I'm happy to elaborate. So I just narrowly on the democracy point. I mean, one thing that I have in the paper I didn't get a chance to say was that the standard indictment of the business corporation. All I wanted to observe is that also constitutes an indictment of 99% of cooperatives, right? In other words, if the absence of worker voting and control over management makes it undemocratic, then most cooperatives are also undemocratic. So where the democracy argument actually pushes, so either it's a really narrow argument about workers, in which case it doesn't support cooperatives, or it's a more general argument. But if it's a more general argument, what it actually pushes in the direction of is stakeholderism. Right? And so that's the point which I didn't make. But then, you start saying, well, then why should just workers vote? And then say, well, how about investors? They have a lot of stake, they should get a vote too. And then people say, okay, well, what about customers? Like they have a lot of stake, they should vote too, right? So one of the things about the co-determination argument is that it tends to push in the direction of just expanding the number of people who get votes. Right? And so there are people in business ethics who are willing to countenance that idea of a multi-stakeholder firm, but it has some fairly significant empirical obstacles. In particular, the fact that it empirically just doesn't exist or like barely exists. So the democracy argument, I think, pushes in that direction, which I didn't mention, that I consider something of a reductio of that argument. But the other thing I want to say just about the co-ops is just that, yeah, so the examples are not intended. I was trying as much as possible to stick to just structural features of cooperatives and argue that because in the background of all this is part of this is just a brief or an argument for the importance of business ethics. And so like I spent my time trying to encourage business people to be more ethical. And the reason why I do that is because I'm not optimistic about structural solutions within the framework of a market economy. So in other words, I don't think they're acting badly because the corporation makes them act badly, or the structure of corporate law, and so that there's some kind of legal fix we can do. So that if we organize the firm as a cooperative rather than a corporation, then suddenly everyone's going to start behaving better. Because I'm negative about that, I think we're just kind of stuck with what we've got. And therefore, it actually is like the most important objective then should be to accept the structures that we have, but then recognize that people working within those structures have a lot more discretion in how they act than they often portray as acting or as having. So on issues like pollution, like firms are not forced to pollute, right? They make a lot of choices, right? And so business ethics is important at actually getting firms to exercise more self-restraint in the way in which they act. Right? So I always try to focus on structural features. So what I'm trying to say is that there's nothing structural about the cooperative that makes it so that people are going to have to behave better when they're in that organizational form than the way they behave when they're in a corporate form. And again, like there's an element of just advantageous selection in that because cooperatives have the kind of warm glow that a lot of people who are drawn to transacting with cooperatives, working in cooperatives tend to be people with higher levels of pro-social motivation. But if we actually have a utopian project that involves generalizing the cooperative form so that it's going to occupy the dominant position in the economy, you have to then imagine what's going to happen when a lot of people who don't have pro-social motives start using that organizational form. That's what I'm always saying to people in philosophy is I say, okay, people come up with these big utopian schemes, and I'll say, okay, well, then what's going to happen when the Wall Street banks, get handed this? What are they going to do with it, right? So you're proposing a legal structure that people are going to want to game it, right? And there are people like the highest paid people there spend their whole lives sitting around trying to figure out how to game these organizational forms. Right? So people with and so that's what I'm skeptical about is that the structure that you're using there is ungameable in a way that's gonna, or like, is like less vulnerable to the kind of gaming that's gonna produce bad social outcomes. Right, so some of it's just an argument for business ethics, that everybody needs to just behave more ethically.
So Joe, I can't help, I can't resist to jump in here, but I used to work with some Wall Street people. And they would always tell me that, you know, like the Visas and MasterCards and even the Goldman Sachs and whatnot, they were organized not as publicly traded firms. They were organized as associations, effectively co-ops. And they all to a person would say their behavior changed overnight when they changed forms. So, I mean, this is not I can't give you an empirical study about that, but I can say that the credit card companies, the Visas and MasterCards, have become a target of major policy interventions ever since they changed forms, because they've done to segment the market and targeted prices in a way that small businesses are disadvantaged. So you may say the form has no bearing, but I can tell you from a policy perspective, I've seen it play out in real time in a number of policy spaces.
Yeah, no, so what I'm trying to say is just, yeah, it's a little bit tricky though. I'm saying, like, it absolutely changes the orientation of the behavior of firm management when you change the ownership group, right? Because you're exercising partiality towards a different class of a different constituency. So, like I said, I don't want to question that the cooperative generates benefits for its members.
I got you.
And if you change organizational forms, you're going to start helping a different group of members.
Except that I'd say the benefits were more generalized in those worlds, and that's what they would say too.
Yeah,
Right?
on the-
I think that's to your point, right?
I'm skeptical.
Yeah, okay. We're gonna talk about this in a second. So here's a question for you from Michael Riddler. Says, in the context of neoliberal globalization, is it possible that co-ops have a structural economic disadvantage in that they are, for the most part, rooted capital? This may impact their bargaining power with governments and employees. Any thoughts on that?
I have a separate paper that I'm working on at the moment talking about the specific problems that worker co-ops experience. And so which is to say, the answer to the question is, I think worker co-ops absolutely have a structural disadvantage. But unfortunately, that structural disadvantage is caused by restrictions on contracting that nobody in their right mind wants to eliminate. Right? In other words, so that is that labor is not fully alienable, which means that workers can't, essentially are legally prohibited from making long-term contracting over their own future labor power. And so the 19th century, it used to be common for workers to sign like 2-year contracts, where I will work for you for 2 years. And if they didn't show up to work, they got sent to prison and sentenced to hard labor for being absent. Right, so we take that to be a period of unfree labor, right? But it's a bit of a misnomer. That was actually a period of free labor. Workers were free to make all kinds of contracts, including 2-3-year contracts over their own future labor. Right, so what we call free labor, which is when you're not like criminally liable for absence from the workplace, is actually a product of restrictions on contracting, and that gives workers it creates a structural disadvantage because they're not able to pledge their input to the firm as collateral on loans. Right, so that's what generates the so-called capital conundrum for worker co-ops, which is that they face particularly high interest charges when it comes to accessing credit, which is why worker co-ops are constantly trying to self-finance. Right, so all I want to say is that that's absolutely a structural constraint on worker co-ops, and that's what explains that number being so low. Right, is access to capital explains most of that, but that's not a nefarious plot of global capital. That's actually like one of the historical victories of working class people, having created those kinds of restrictions on contracting. And nobody wants to go back to an age in which workers are actually able to pre-commit to their future labor and not violate those commitments without criminal sanction. Right? But if you're morally committed to that, then you're committed to a system in which workers are going to be highly disadvantaged when it comes to getting loans.
So we're just about at 5:30 here. We are at 5:30. I do have a nice comment here for you, Joe, and it's from Andrew. He says, "Thank you for sharing your contrarian view. Helps me contextualize credit unions and other financial cooperatives with your views. And it's challenged me to think about the specific circumstances that will favor cooperative ownership in the future. And I'd even argue that the loss of democratic control is eroding their discipline, financial cooperatives discipline relative to banks." So I don't know if you have any reflections on that, but more of a comment.
I mean, one thing I'll just throw out there is just to say, I mean, I think all these conversations are really, really interesting, and a unified framework where everybody's talking about the same stuff is actually really, really helpful. So like in business ethics, over the 30 years that I've been doing it, like a lot of the discussion has been focused on the challenges of governance, right? Because if you look at like the junk bond era and like the takeover bids and then the Enron era and the accounting scandals and those kind of stuff, like all of that was actually the owners of firms being exploited in various ways by management. Right? So there's a limitation of my nexus of contracts view with the 4 constituencies. It's that there should actually be a 5th constituency called management that at a certain level becomes its own interest group, right? And so in business ethics, there's a lot of talk about like the view is not that, oh, shareholders are these like lucky duckies who get to have all these profits, right? Rather, they're people who are like kind of struggling to exercise control over these organizations where the managers are kind of super powerful and able to exploit them in various ways, right? And so I think that everyone, like governance is just way, way more important than we sort of historically have thought. A lot of focus on ownership, not enough on governance. Right. And so then a lot of this work, especially like Hans's work, which has really influenced me, also looks at cooperatives through the lens of governance, right? And whether or not you can, like, so that's where the game is. Can you actually exercise effective governance? And I think that's like where a conversation where there's really useful cross-pollination between the work that's been done about corporations and the work that's been done on cooperatives. And seeing how they're similar to one another helps you to focus on like the challenges that both organizations face. So that would be my parting. Like,
beautiful, and this is a lot of fun. I want to thank you, Joe, for sharing a challenge view and challenging view, and I look forward to the conversation later on. Thank you, Joe, and have a good night.
thank you for that.